Hello, and thank you for joining us. The following video is an extract from one of a series of academic worldwide Wednesday webinars hosted by the Institute of Economic Affairs. In this video, we hear from Professor Mark Pennington of King's College London, who shares his thoughts on Hayek and pandemic response.
Okay, thanks everybody. I've actually just been joined by an ice cream van, which you may be able to hear in the background, so sorry about that. But welcome everybody, and thanks to the IEA for hosting this event. So I should start by saying that I framed the talk as being about coronavirus response, but my aim in the presentation is not to come to some conclusion about which response to the pandemic is right or wrong. In fact, a key implication of my remarks will be that we may not be able to know what a right or wrong response to the pandemic actually looks like. So my aim is going to be to highlight the type of policy challenge that coronavirus presents, and to show how an understanding of this challenge can be informed by considering some key insights from Hayek's thought. I then want to take these insights to reflect on some broader problems of public policy. So the structure of my remarks will be quite straightforward. I'll start by discussing Hayek's distinction between simple and complex phenomena. I'll then consider how this might inform our understanding of the coronavirus policy challenge. And then finally, I'll offer some thoughts on how understanding the nature of this particular policy challenge can help us to think about the broader challenges that public policy is now being urged to take on, focusing in particular on the new fashion for industrial policies. So let me start by looking at the distinction Hayek makes between simple and complex systems or phenomena. So a key aspect of Hayek's social theory is the distinction he makes between simple and complex systems. Simple phenomena or systems are those where it's possible from a given starting position to predict the outcomes that will be generated by the application of some stimulus into the system. Scientific problems in some parts of physics are of this type, and they allow for the derivation of predictive, quantitative regularities by the scientist or theorist. Complex phenomena, by contrast, refer to situations where the elements that make up a greater whole or order do not interact in a linear fashion, and where the number of elements and the character of their interaction is too vast for them to be comprehended by the scientist or analyst. The most that the scientist can do when faced with these kind of phenomena is to understand the general principles that allow an order to form between the different elements, not to predict the precise form that the order will take. The most that science may be able to do in the face of such phenomena is to predict a range of different outcomes. Now, it's tempting to equate this distinction between simple and complex phenomena with the difference between the subject matter of the natural and the social sciences, but this would be mistaken. While it's true that some natural sciences analyze simple systems, this is not always the case. Many of the phenomena analyzed in biology or ecology, for example, are closer to complex systems. In many cases, the most that the natural scientists can discover are the general principles of an order, such as, for example, the principles of ecological succession that drive processes of environmental change. But the scientists typically can't know enough about the relationships between elements in these systems to predict precisely how, for example, ecosystems will evolve given certain exogenous or endogenous changes to them. Now, when we turn to the socio-economic world, we are in most circumstances referring to an even more complex system or set of systems. Knowledge of all the varied economic and cultural conditions that confront multitudes of people and that drive their decisions cannot be comprehended by any single social scientist or group of social scientists. The most that social science can do when faced with such complex phenomena is to understand the general principles of social interaction and the type of patterns they might produce, without being able to predict specific responses to specific events. So, for example, we can understand that if a good becomes more scarce in a market, various changes in producer and consumer behavior can be expected. But we can't know in any quantitative sense what the specific response will be. Moreover, we may not even be able to specify the range of responses, because unlike the natural world, the human elements that make up the social ecology are creative agents. This is what makes the evolution of many social phenomena impossible to predict in other than the broadest of terms. If you want a recent analysis of this, I very much recommend the recent book by Mervyn King on radical uncertainty, which illustrates the point that I've just been making. Now, the key point that Hayek takes from these distinctions is that whereas simple systems can be subject to planning and control by a directive intelligence, complex systems cannot be subject to such control. Whatever objectives we may have, therefore, whether they pertain to health, economic growth, environmental protection, or some combination of these, will have to be achieved by indirect mechanisms. The most that we can do is to try to find rules that allow for many of the agents that make up a complex system to adapt to the actions of others without having to know all of the factors that drive those actions. On a Hayekian view, the mechanisms and rules that work most effectively will be those that provide clear feedback mechanisms and enable relatively speedy adaptation to changing information at the local level. Now, in brief, this analysis is what underlies Hayek's case for a market economy over a planned or centrally managed economy. A market economy can be understood as a complex adaptive system where property rights and freedom of contract enable an intricate ecology of dispersed individuals and organizations to experiment in responding to their own circumstances, and for the results of these experiments to be communicated to neighboring actors via profit and loss signals. The point that Hayek makes here is that no directive intelligence could be aware of all the possible margins for adjustment at the various nodes of a complex economic order. There's no suggestion here that learning and adaptation in a market economy are instantaneous, but rather a comparative claim that learning and adaptation in a market economy are speedier than would be the case if we had to rely on some kind of centrally controlled alternative. Neither is there a suggestion that prices communicate all of the necessary information to facilitate adaptation. In many circumstances, price signals will be noisy. The claim is simply that we are better off with price signals and the information that they communicate, rather than in circumstances where those price signals are suppressed. Competition in a market is a mechanism for dealing with the fact that the price signals are noisy and we have different readings of the implications that we might derive from them. Now, Hayek recognizes that we can't have market solutions to all socioeconomic problems, but he suggests that where we can't have market solutions, the challenge is to find policy mechanisms that operate in a manner analogous to markets, where solutions emerge through bottom-up feedback mechanisms and competitive or quasi-competitive processes. One example of this, I think, is to be found in the work of Elinor Ostrom and her notion of polycentricity, or the way that federal systems can mimic aspects of the kind of evolutionary mechanisms that operate in market systems. So what does all of this discussion have to do with the coronavirus policy challenge? Well, we're certainly dealing with a complex and not a simple problem. There are several levels to this complexity that I think we can identify. The first layer of complexity concerns the epidemiology of the virus. So epidemiological problems, although involving a natural science phenomena, are not of the simple physics type. But most we can know are the principles of how a virus spreads and perhaps the range of possible outcomes. But the precise manner that a virus spreads through a population will depend on a host of context-specific variables that may not be accessible to the scientists or the experts concerned. I think we see this very clearly in the problem of modeling the spread of the pandemic and the sometimes very different projections of the peak of the disease. There is significant uncertainty about the science. Will the virus peter out of its own accord? How is the virus affected by weather and geography? Will there be a second wave later in the year? Will the virus mutate into weaker or stronger forms? These are problems, questions, where there are no clear answers because of the very nature of the phenomena that we're dealing with. Now, we have a second layer of complexity to the problem because the virus is going to be interacting with a complex human system. How will the virus respond to public policy measures? Will any second wave of the virus be bigger because of lockdowns? How will people themselves respond to public policy measures and the evolution of the virus? We could be dealing here with a situation where there are what economists would call Lucas-type effects. So if a vaccine is around the corner, or we think that herd immunity is around the corner, will this lead people to behave in ways in the immediate term that actually worsen the problem? This is another layer of complexity. We have a further layer of complexity when we think that the problems that I've just described so far just relate to one dimension. That's managing the spread of the virus or the possible health effects of the virus. But the problem of complexity is even greater when we think that policymakers faced with dealing with this problem have to manage multiple other margins relating to health, but also the economic consequences of the virus and of the responses that are adopted to it. If lockdowns are introduced, then at what length or level of lockdown are deaths from the coronavirus outweighed by deaths from conditions that are not treated owing to the lockdown? At what point is loss of life and the economic costs from the virus versus loss of life and economic costs from responding to the virus in some kind of balance? And in all of these considerations, what are the relevant timescales that we need to consider the relevant margins on? These are highly complex challenges. The question we have to ask ourselves is, are there any systemic mechanisms that enable policymakers to cope with this kind of complexity, to arrive at an effective response to the virus? And by an effective response, I mean a response that balances the objectives of controlling the virus in a way that reflects tolerable costs in terms of foregone health, social, and other economic objectives. Now, in a situation like this, which is an emergency situation, we don't have a market solution to the problem. The question is, do we have a public policy solution that has some kind of systemic mechanisms that will enable policymakers to identify effective solutions? That's the question that I want to move on to now. I'm actually very skeptical of whether there are any systemic mechanisms that enable policymakers to identify the right kind of response, or to even identify what a right response might consist of. One thing that I would say here is that it's clear that if we're going to have any hope of discovering what the best response to the crisis might be, is that we need to have counterfactuals. We need to see that there are alternative solutions and to see what the effects of those different models might be. Now, in this sense, I think we should be thankful for the fact that the world lacks an administrative structure to enforce some kind of global governance approach to the pandemic. By that, I mean an approach where a global agency, informed by expert opinion, enforces some kind of common policy approach to the pandemic through a form of international treaty. What I would say here is, thank heavens for Sweden. Thank heavens that Sweden is pursuing a different approach to those adopted in many parts of Europe and in other parts of the world. Not necessarily because the approach that Sweden has adopted is the right approach, because without having outliers like Sweden, we would have little way of generating any sense of the kind of alternatives that might be available. Just as central economic planning deprives us of the information generated by competitive experimentation in a market, so a global governance approach would deprive us of any sense of the possible opportunity costs associated with different responses to the virus. The current response that we see at the global level, thankfully, does not rely on some kind of global directive intelligence. We don't have a purely planned attempt to address the problem. We have some level of decentralization, exercised largely through the powers of nation states, and to a lesser extent, within some states where federal systems exist. However, we also have a massive signal extraction problem for policymakers in trying to decipher what can usefully be learned from the experiences that other countries or regions are having with dealing with the virus. So, for example, even if the Swedish model works in Sweden, would it work in the cultural circumstances of the UK? That's far from obvious. Similarly, has Germany got a lower death rate than the UK because of the contract tracing that they've introduced? Or is the lower death rate to be explained by the fact that the German healthcare system makes much greater use of private providers and market forces than we do here in the UK? It's not clear what the answer to those questions might be. What is the time frame within which we should make an evaluation of health and economic effects of different policy responses? Will countries that look to be doing well now look so good if a second, possibly larger wave of the virus arrives in the autumn or in the winter? And how will all of these different evaluations be affected by the arrival or not, as the case may be, of a vaccine? It seems to me we have to recognize that no matter how much private or public money is put into the search for a vaccine, to all intents and purposes, whether we get a vaccine or not is to a significant extent outside of anyone's control. And yet it could have dramatic effects in terms of the way in which we evaluate the different kind of policy responses that are actually being proposed to this virus. Now, the conclusion that I derive from all of this is that beyond the capacity to learn perhaps some very general lessons, such as, for example, the importance of social distancing and the prioritization of protecting the elderly, we have to recognize that politicians and policy experts are operating in a fog of ignorance, where to a significant extent, their capacity to arrive at tolerable solutions will be the result of accidents. People might stumble on what turns out to be a beneficial response, but it won't be because they're exercising some kind of directive intelligence or planned response to the problem. In my view, there are few, if any, systemic processes that are operating in the policy-making process that are likely to push us towards more beneficial outcomes and away from worse outcomes. In these circumstances, we should actually be very sympathetic towards policymakers. We shouldn't be too hard on them because they're operating in a fog of ignorance where it's very difficult to learn what the right response should actually be to this mother of all problems. Now, in the final part of my remarks, I want to consider what the challenge facing policymakers in responding to the pandemic might perhaps tell us about some of the other responsibilities policymakers are increasingly being urged to take upon themselves. In my view, the inherently clumsy nature of the policy response to the pandemic demonstrates very clearly why we should only rely on public policy as a resource allocation mechanism when there is no market or market-like decision-making framework available as an alternative. Yet commentators from across the political spectrum have been reaching a very different set of conclusions. It's becoming widely believed that we should look increasingly, if not to eliminate market mechanisms, then to curtail them with various forms of planning and control. I note, for example, the renewed enthusiasm for industrial policy, so-called Green New Deals and targeted protectionism, much of it inspired by populist sentiment, but also at an elite level, spurred on by the influence of academics such as Mariana Mazzucato. This trend, in my view, is profoundly worrying, because I think that the more we rely on public policy mechanisms to allocate resources, then in effect, the more we will be generating situations analogous to the informational conditions that face politicians in determining how to respond to the current pandemic. In other words, we will be relying on mechanisms where decision-making successes, such as they are the product of fortuitous accident, rather than arising from any systemic tendency within the process of public decision-making. I'd like to illustrate this point by looking at the evidence presented in favour of industrial policies by Mazzucato. She argues that because some of today's technological innovations had their origins in acts of government spending, this demonstrates that the directive intelligence of the entrepreneurial state can improve on market outcomes. Yet the evidence Mazzucato cites simply doesn't support these conclusions. Those who support market solutions have never argued that it's impossible for industrial policies or targeted protectionism to generate positive results. What they've suggested is that these successes will be fortuitous accidents, because in the absence of a competitive market, there is no systemic mechanism that enables policymakers to learn whether their various decisions or interventions add to or detract from public welfare in comparison to alternative possibilities. The evidence Mazzucato cites doesn't demonstrate the power of directive intelligence. On the one hand, she fails to mention all the multiple acts of government spending that don't generate beneficial innovations. And on the other hand, she fails to recognize that those acts of spending that appear to have generated beneficial innovations have not been the result of some directive intelligence. The benefits were essentially unintended consequences of essentially random acts of government spending, especially in the defense sector. Unintended consequences, I might add, that were adapted to by private agents operating in a competitive market with price signals. If you read Mazzucato and other enthusiasts for industrial policy, you will search in vain for an explanation of the mechanisms that are supposed systematically to enable the state to direct innovation effectively or to invest strategically in a particular comparative advantage. In effect, we have theories which suggest that if the state spends enough money, it will be a miracle if none of it ends up doing some good. Well, that's no kind of theory for public policy making. It's a theory of accidents and nothing else. It used to be a standing line of argument among Marxists and Keynesians that the believers in the market economy basically had a blind faith in the power of what was, as they saw it, essentially an accidental mechanism that might, by accident, coordinate resource allocation. Yet the theory of the market economy, as set out by Hayek, isn't based on blind faith. It's based on a systemic explanation for the superiority of predominantly market-based processes. When the coronavirus nightmare is over, and we have the choice once again of relying on market processes that do have systemic mechanisms to deal with the problems of complexity, this is a lesson that desperately, it seems, needs to be relearned. Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching. That was clearly a thought-provoking talk from Mark, which raised a number of questions on issues such as dispersed knowledge and what Hayek referred to as the fatal conceit. For more details about online content, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, IA London, and listen to our podcasts at Podbean, and visit our website. And to help us keep providing free content during these tough times, please do consider making a contribution, no matter how modest, by donating online at ia.org.uk. Thank you.